Archetypes have been an important part of fighting games ever since they first gained a character select screen in Street Fighter 2. Even if you don't fully understand the idea of a Shoto, you probably know all about the more commonly discussed Grappler and Zoner. In the 30 plus years since Street Fighter 2, a lot has changed in fighting games, and way more archetypes have sprung up out the woodwork. In this series, I want to talk about the ones we don't really have strict definitions for, and pin down how they play, why you might play them, and most useful for you at home, how to play against them. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the single most fan requested archetype, Parry Characters. Right off the bat, I'd like to note that there's a huge difference between a Parry character and a character with a parry. This is even further exacerbated by games where parry is a universal option. I'll put out a video about playing games with universal parries separate from this one eventually, but just to be clear, this isn't about that. I think a clear and fast delineation for this is JP in Street Fighter 6. He's a character with a very strong parry, one that's almost overwhelming, and it defines his neutral, his pressure, and his defense, and it needs to be constantly accounted for by his opponent when they're trying to run an offense on him, but he still isn't a parry character, because his core game plan fully surrounds getting the opponent to full screen and keeping them there. He's a dyed-in-the-wool zoner regardless of his parry. Parry characters are the much more unique and identifiable archetype that blends an essentially always valid parry in with their offense. Parry in itself is a weak win condition to base a character around, since inherently, to parry requires some guesswork. So sometimes they can look a lot like another archetype if you ignore their parry completely, but they tend to be missing something required for that archetype to work wholly on its own, even if it's just having the power level of that archetype toned down to around 70%, and so they then have the parry to turn that other archetype into a parry character. For example, most mix-up characters are mix-up characters because their mix is air-type, and your opponent must guess something like a 4-way mix-up, and they have no option but to do so, because some kind of knockdown tool keeps the opponent stationary that you can then use mid-block string or on the opponent's wake-up. Fujin is Anji's mix-up tool and it has multiple enders, but it's not airtight at all. There's many ways for the opponent to hit or grab Anji out of it. To make up for this, Anji can instead choose to spin and ignore his opponent's attempt to mash out of his pressure, which can potentially lead to greater rewards than just hitting the mix-up directly would have. This then enforces respect and makes Anji scarier at all times, since all of his specials can validly be used as a follow-up from spin, or be held in to become spin. It is literally always valid, and this was what ties a parry character together. How often their parry comes into gameplay, and how much of the game it's in play for. Hakumen in BlazBlue literally has parry bound to the A button. Leroy in Tekken can parry almost every single move in the entire game, and Baiken in Accent Core can cancel her own block stun into an attack of her own, basically negating any regular block string and requiring you to know Baiken's specific pressure to pressure her at all. Before I can talk strategy though, first I need to talk about the who and the why of parry characters, because these guys are all about ego. These are probably the single most momentum based archetype, even more so than the snowball character as far as the mind game of fighting games goes, and playing them is about getting in your opponent's head. If they can't read you, they lose their momentum, they fumble more and more, and completely fall to pieces. Now, don't take this to assume that parry players are all doing it because they're narcissists. There's 3 main reasons to play these guys, but the overlap is ego. Whether it's that you find the idea of parries personally fulfilling and cool, or you love dominating your opponent and feeling like a genius by making it obvious you knew what they were going to do, or you enjoy winning via a large number of interactions per round rather than just 2 or 3 big combos. All of these are in some way about self-fulfillment, which is what makes the player's ego the defining factor in the playstyle of these characters. Ego is actually very powerful in fighting games and is a defining part of some of the best players ever's toolkits, but ego is as strong as it is fragile, and so we need to talk about rhythm. Of course, I don't mean literal musical rhythm, but more so the less tangible mental flow of fighting games. One of the simplest yet most powerful ways of showcasing this sequenced rhythmic part of the FGC mind game is this poem that was written by an unknown EVO finalist. That being, they wouldn't throw me a third time, right? Oftentimes, the sheer stupidity and simplicity of an action can severely throw off an opponent's calculations of how likely that action actually is. And this is a core part of playing characters like grapplers or parry characters. It's quite common for people to become so scared of a high reward option that they get tunnel vision defending against just that option, and completely crumble to any other ones. Which is why to play these guys you have to be aware of the immense psychic damage that getting off a single parry does, and perhaps even more than that, the unspoken rule that if you've parried twice, you've won the round. And while obviously that isn't literally true, it will often only net you less than 50% reward in most fighting games, the sheer momentum swing this nets you in terms of how much this affects your opponent's ability to act correctly can almost assure you a victory. And so, there's a simple two-step plan to playing the parry character, one that comes with a plan A and plan B, depending on your opponent. Part 1 of both plans is the same: land a parry on reaction. Most characters don't actually have moves that are fully neutrally reactable, which would be something like a charged attack or focus attack, around 14 to 21 frames. That's around when a move can become reactable, and anything beyond that is a freebie. But most moves have way less startup than that and land anywhere between 4 and 10 frames. And this is where looking for an option comes into play. Because when something's called reactable, it's called such because you can respond to it when any option could be valid, and you're not even looking for that specific thing. If you're looking for a specific option, this window can be lessened to an insane degree. And while I'm not asking for you to be Daigo and react within single frame windows, you can use context and pattern recognition as well as a rough estimate of move value, i.e. how high the reward is for a move, and use a process of elimination for your reaction. Like, if your opponent has jumped, and you know their jumping heavy kick is fantastic, you can look specifically for that option. Same goes for less reactable scenarios, like round start. If your opponent has a habit, you can punish that habit. A lot of people use a long range normal on round start or jump at the opponent or dash forward. The point is to play very warily of the opponent, and perhaps even allow yourself to be on the back foot and corner yourself, to then look for a reactable opening where you get a 100% guaranteed parry with no risk involved. This then, without fail, will throw the opponent off somewhat, but it hasn't won you the game in itself. You then have to hard dedicate to either option A or B. A being to fish for a second parry, and B being to play without parrying at all. This might sound like a huge dedication to make, but even at a beginner level, it's surprisingly easy to know which choice is appropriate. You'll likely have figured it out long before stage 1 is over, and while frankly some people who should know better will happily mash into you and get parried all day, some players will either form a more careful offense after getting parried to avoid it as much as possible, while some will try and throw as much as they can to get through your parry, and others will try and run away and make you have to be the active party. But either way, the fact that you've forced them to adapt their strategy can mark a significant turning point for you and an opportunity to very quickly swing momentum in your favour. Some characters like Angie even take advantage of the fact that throw beats their parry and have inbuilt hopping attacks that snuff throw attempts. That's really the main thing to worry about with these guys, and something I'll go into deeper in a parry strategy specific video, that really the main thing you need to look out for is being freely grabbable. Most of the time, grabs, whether yours or your opponent's, tend to be equal to the reward you would get from a parry. And while that's not always the case, generally you want to dissuade your opponent from even trying to grab you by playing around the option as much as you can, whether that's using instant overheads, DPs, grabbing them first, whatever works. And for those who are trying to counter parry characters, you need to figure out their strategy very quickly. While at a high level it's going to be a lot more fluid than the whole plan A, plan B thing that I've described, parry characters are creatures of habit, and if you play to disrupt that rhythm and don't just let them steamroll you, that is a very big deal. And while you're fighting, don't be too afraid of the parry. The reward may be good, but your fear and the respect they earn from it is a lot more worth it to them than the parry itself is. And while I'm not suggesting you just flail around, you're going to have to pick your chances and start mixing up between those jumping heavy kicks I talk about and just empty jump throw, and keeping the rhythm out of their hands. If you've been forced to be on the back foot, for the love of God, tech the throw. It's easy to think that parry characters are just baiting you so they can then shimmy and punish your throw with, or parry you on wake up, but more often than not they're delighting in your suffering and enjoying the opportunity that they get to play without thinking too much. If you force them back into playing proper neutral, it'll throw them off of the warpath they were on and put you back in the seat to gain the upper hand and run your game plan again. Thanks to you guys for watching. I tried to cover all the bases easily within this video, since although it's a popular, well liked and well understood archetype, strategy is the main thing people struggle with both as and against them, and I thought that some further delineation on what actually counts as one would help too, since there can often be confusion about why certain characters from other archetypes have parries, and whether that makes them a parry character or not. That being said though, I know the way certain characters' parries operate can differ a great deal and be more or less difficult to use or counter, so if there are any questions, like always you can sound off in the comments about skills to do with this archetype that I didn't fully cover, and as always I'll do my best to get back to every query, question and suggestion. If you'd like to have direct hand in future content I make, you can support me on Patreon or via YouTube membership, where you'll get access to polls, early access to videos and scripts, or you can even have your name in the credits like my very first supporter you can see on screen now, or even have a personalised shout out of your username or some other alias that I'm allowed to say out loud, and you can visit both of those via the description down below, or at patreon.com/TheRumaFGC. If you enjoy these videos and would like to support me in my future content, whether that's more Archetype archives or my reviews and news coverage, you can always support me by just leaving a like, commenting, and maybe even sharing it with a friend. And if you know someone that you're trying to get into fighting games but they're just not getting it, or they're just too scared to take the deep dive, I have multiple playlists full of tutorials that you can watch to help both them and yourself improve your focus, your execution, and your mind games. Thanks again for everyone who made it this far through the video, and as always I'm going to leave you all by saying, stay safe.